funny thing that Richard Nixon declared during his presidency as the war on drugs. Many people have been for or against drugs, the legalization of drugs, for decades now. And no matter where you are on the spectrum of drug legalization, I think all of us can say one thing with quite certainty: the war on drugs ain't actually working. How many of you have heard of an organization called LEAP? L-E-A-P. That stands for Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. These are police officers and lawyers who have seen, I guarantee you many of them got into this believing drugs were bad, but they're looking at the solution to this problem and saying it's no solution at all. And we see how it is affecting disproportionately minorities in this country, those who just don't have the money to get out from underneath the crushing weight. It doesn't make sense anymore. It's not working. And the drugs keep pouring in. Okay? Who remembers just say no? Well, a lot of people just said yes.
Dare.
Okay, dare as well. Okay? No one's listening. And now it's more prevalent than ever. Okay? And we're very pleased to have a representative of LEAP come here and talk to you, not just about the organization, but why a group of police officers and lawyers got together and had to finally agree that, yeah, this thing, war on drugs, it ain't working. Everybody, Miss Joanne Naughton.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here this afternoon at the Save Long Island event, and I'd like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk about this country's drug policy. As you just found out, I'm retired from the New York Police Department, the NYPD. I was a police officer, a detective, a sergeant. I retired as a lieutenant after over 20 years. As a detective, way back in the 1970s, I worked undercover in the narcotics division. I went out on the streets of the Bronx and Manhattan, and I bought drugs from street dealers: heroin, cocaine, pills, marijuana, whatever was available. And my backup teams eventually arrested those dealers. And we did this as good soldiers in the war on drugs. I made hundreds and hundreds of drug buys, and my teams arrested every one of those dealers. And let me assure you that most dealers are just small-time drug users. They sell to support their habits. I believed in this country's drug policy, and I believed I was doing the right thing when I helped wage the war on drugs. But I'm now willing to admit, after looking at the evidence, that I was wrong. Prohibition doesn't work. It never has. Prohibition has been a failure. I'm also an attorney. I represented criminal defendants in Manhattan with the Legal Aid Society. Many of my clients were young people who either possessed drugs or sold drugs, nothing violent, and they were facing years of incarceration along with a lifetime felony record. So my experience with our drug policy is hands-on. I know what's going on, both from the police prosecution perspective, as well as from the point of view of the person who's been arrested and who now faces a pretty grim future. After over 40 years of fighting the war on drugs, you'd think that either this war would have been won by now, or that we'd face the fact that it isn't working and tried something new. Just before I retired from teaching, one of my criminal justice students told me about Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, LEAP. It's an organization, as you were told, of police officers prosecutors, judges, federal agents, corrections officers, and other members of law enforcement, both active and retired, who are dedicated to ending the prohibition of drugs in this country. By the time I heard about LEAP, I had already come to the realization on my own that the law enforcement approach has not gotten rid of drugs in this country, and in fact, has made things worse. Today, drugs are more available, purer, and cheaper than before. I now believe drugs should be legalized, all drugs, regulated and taxed. And I go ahead. And I volunteer my time to speak about the issues as a member of LEAP. I'm not salaried, I'm not here on any payroll. I do this because I believe it's the right thing to do. Our name, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, of course, refers to the prohibition of alcohol back in 1920 to 1933. This was a period of time characterized by gangsters and violence. And it was a time when the average citizen broke the law. Alcohol was blamed for many of society's ills, especially crime. But Prohibition failed to bring about the perfect, sober, crime-free world they expected. Then the stock market crash of 1929 and the onset of a terrible economic depression meant people needed, dare I say it, jobs, and the government needed money. And it sounds familiar. Making alcohol legal again opened up many new jobs for the people, as well as providing additional sorely needed revenue in the form of taxes. Back then, in 1929, a man who's known as the father of professional policing, August Vollmer, was the primary author of the Wickersham Commission report, and that was the study that served to bring an end to the prohibition of alcohol. Vollmer opposed the enforcement of drug laws. He said, quote, "They engender disrespect both for law and for the agents of law enforcement." And his words ring as true today as they did in 1929. After over 40 years of a drug war, people, especially young people, don't look at cops as heroes, but as people to be feared, making it more difficult for cops to fight real crime. Cops rely on the public to help them solve cases. They can't do it by themselves. But today, an awful lot of people don't want anything to do with cops. They fear them. Eventually, Prohibition came to an end in 1933, after only 13 years. Prohibition was characterized by violence, and today's war on drugs is no different. It is also characterized by violence. Not by those who use drugs, but from the war on drugs. Drug dealers fighting in the streets over the very lucrative, illegal drug market. You don't see liquor store owners shooting it out over who's going to sell Bud Light on the block. Today, the right to sell beer and wine and other alcohol is regulated. Today, we buy our alcohol from respectable business people. I can tell you that most drug users are not violent. Usually, they just want to be left alone. But the illegal drug trade is extraordinarily violent. Many police officers have spent their entire careers risking their lives for the sake of the drug war. We've seen colleagues killed in the struggle, not to mention the many civilians, innocent men and women and children, caught up in the violence because very often they happen to be at the wrong place at the wrong time, maybe caught in the crossfire of a shootout between drug dealers. It is a major waste of resources to be putting so much time and money and lives into prosecuting, arresting non-violent drug offenders. Drug users who are harming no one should either be left alone or, if they wanted, given treatment. When we arrest them, we cause far more harm than drugs do. A felony conviction makes it extremely difficult, or even impossible in some cases, to have a career, to get a job, to get an education, housing. The right to vote is lost forever in this country for many people with a felony conviction. And the effect of incarceration on families and neighborhoods is devastating. This war on drugs harms people more than drugs do. Excuse me. The use of drugs is a health matter, not a matter for criminal justice. In fact, numerous medical organizations have concluded that marijuana can be a safe, effective medicine. But patients who cannot obtain marijuana legally, and for whom the standard legal drugs are not safe or effective, had two terrible choices. Either continue to suffer, or buy marijuana illegally and take some really serious risks. Patients who cannot obtain marijuana legally risk not being able to get enough to help with some of the side effects of their cancer treatments, for example, or enough to relieve anxiety, or the symptoms of arthritis, glaucoma, chronic pain. They also face the terrifying risk of buying marijuana that is contaminated when they have to get it from the criminal market. And otherwise, law-abiding people face the risk of being arrested, fined, having their property forfeited, being incarcerated, and having a criminal record. I can tell you about a woman I know. She's a grandmother, as well as a decent, hardworking woman. She lives on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. She got cancer. She went through the traditional medical treatments, and then she found herself suffering from the side effects of those treatments. She had pain and constant nausea and appetite loss because she heard, excuse me, because she heard that marijuana might help her with those symptoms. She went out on the streets of Manhattan and stopped total strangers until she found someone who could help her get marijuana. A stranger on the street. That's not the way anyone should have to get medical help. I know from my own experience in the police department that prohibition's a bad policy. Prohibition doesn't work, never has, never will. Every time we put a so-called drug kingpin away, you've read about those arrests, those prosecutions. There's a slew of others waiting to take his place. It's another job opening. There's too much money involved. The illicit drug market is far too lucrative to be arrested away. They say insanity is doing the same thing over and over, and each time expecting a different result. Our drug policy is an example of insanity. The prohibition of drugs began in 1914 with the Harrison Act, and that was directed at doctors, and it regulated opium and opium derivatives and cocaine, largely because 1.3% of the population was said to be addicted. Remember that number. Then, years later, in 1970, President Nixon established a committee to study the effects of marijuana, just marijuana, and make recommendations for a drug policy. 9 of the 13 members of the commission were appointed by President Nixon. When he found out the commission was going to recommend decriminalization of marijuana, he rejected the report. He said he wouldn't follow any such recommendation. And every president since Nixon, Democrat and Republican, has escalated the war. In 1972, justification for rejecting the commission's recommendations and for continuing the war on drugs included the fact that the addiction rate was about 1.3% of the population, just as it had been in 1914. Nothing changed. Shouldn't there have been some indication that banning these substances for almost 60 years had reduced use, at least reduced addiction? The reality is Americans want their drugs and Americans will have their drugs. Not all Americans, but a sizable number. Americans are the largest consumers of illegal drugs in the world. Let's look at some of the costs of the drug war. Federal spending on fighting the war on drugs has increased 1,800%, 1,800% over the past 20 years. A few years ago, a highly respected economics professor at Harvard, a guy called Jeffrey Myron, found that federal, state, and local governments annually spend roughly $44 billion to enforce drug prohibition. And it still doesn't work. Here's another cost. Fighting the war on drugs has made the U.S. the incarceration nation. We have only 5% of the world's population, yet we have 25% of the world's prisoners. Right now, we have about 7 million people in the system, over 2 million incarcerated, about 500,000 of whom are drug law violators, and the rest are on probation and parole. That's shameful. It's also very expensive. For the most part, people don't come out of prison fully, especially if they went in young, fully able to resume a nice tax-paying, middle-class, drug-free life. Prison doesn't do much to further those goals. Here's another cost. For various reasons, murder is a relatively easy crime to solve. And in 1963, before the war on drugs, American police departments cleared 91% of homicides. Today, that number is down to 61. Today, across this country, 60% of reported rapes are not prosecuted. 60% of arsons and 75% of robberies go unsolved. Today, police departments are concentrating on non-violent drug law offenders. From 2002 to 2012, the NYPD spent 1 million work hours arresting people for marijuana possession, not even sales, possession. I don't see any role here for law enforcement. We need to spend our time and money and resources arresting criminals who truly threaten public safety. Killers and rapists, cyber criminals, terrorists, instead of chasing after non-violent drug offenders. And let me be clear, I'm not advocating or promoting any type of drug use, but I'm also not advocating wasteful, harmful, and misguided policies that don't work. It's time for a new approach. In the late 90s, drug abuse had become a significant and seemingly uncontrollable social problem in Portugal. So they passed a law decriminalizing all illicit drugs for personal use, including cocaine and heroin. The drugs are decriminalized, meaning they're not legal, but violations are considered administrative, like traffic tickets, rather than criminal. Instead of being sent to criminal courts and prisons, users are sent for counseling and, when necessary, treatment. No criminal record. Despite loud warnings to the contrary from the drug war hawks, usage rates dropped substantially for virtually every substance among the critical age group, 13 to 18-year-olds. Portugal is happy with the results. Switzerland is another example. In the late 1980s and early 90s, Switzerland had a terrible problem with heroin abuse, along with increasing numbers of HIV/AIDS cases as a result of illicit drug use. They developed a new policy that began to look at drug addiction as an illness. As part of this change, in '94, they developed an experiment to treat heroin addicts with government-manufactured heroin, taking the illegal market out of the equation. In addition, they authorized methadone programs, safe injection rooms, needle exchange programs across the country, including prisons. And I should add a word here about American prisons. Although they are probably the most secure in the world, each and every American prison has a drug problem. You can't keep drugs out of prisons. How are you going to keep it out of the country? The results in Switzerland were positive. Felony crimes committed by patients in the program for at least a year dropped on average by 80%. Rates of HIV and hepatitis among drug users plummeted, along with a serious reduction in the consumption of illicit heroin. Their comprehensive public health approach also saves Switzerland money. Criminal justice costs have been reduced because of the reduced rates of crime. Elements of the program have been emulated by other countries: Germany, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, England, Spain, Canada, no, not the US. So, despite catastrophic warnings that helping addicts, instead of prosecuting them, sends the wrong message, the Swiss program has led to fewer new heroin users. They're happy with the results. They aren't going back to the bad old days of total prohibition. In the Netherlands, where cannabis is de facto legalized, the marijuana usage rates are half the rates of the US, where it's been illegal all this time. This was explained by the health minister when he said, "We have succeeded in making marijuana boring." The mystique is gone. It's not sexy for them anymore. Professor Myron's study also shows that federal, state, and local governments forego, give up, throw away, turn their back on roughly $33 billion a year in tax revenues, assuming drugs were legal and taxed at rates similar to those on alcohol and tobacco. And in May of 2010, California reported it was collecting $50 to $100 million in taxes from medical marijuana. That's just medical marijuana in one state. But under prohibition, those revenues are profits for the illegal drug cartels. We need to stop being emotional about the problem, thinking we can do the impossible, make the world drug-free. That's magical thinking. A guy called Kevin Sabet, he's a former senior advisor to the White House drug czar. He's an avid proponent of keeping drugs illegal. But even he had to admit, he said, "We've had generations to make current efforts against drugs better. And we haven't, because we can't. If we could possibly be successful in eliminating illegal drugs," he said, "we would have done it long ago. And if such a thing were at all possible," he said, "it wouldn't take generations for us to do it." And he's right. Human beings have always used substances to relax, to feel good. That's human nature, and there's nothing wrong with it. But we know there will always be some people who will become addicted for various reasons. Some people are more vulnerable than others when it comes to addictions. Some people become addicted to certain activities, drinking alcohol, or caffeine, or gambling, that most of us can engage in without becoming dependent or addicted. We have to try to minimize that number of people and help the people who truly need help. Remember that when drugs were made illegal in 1914, the government justified that by saying that 1.3% of the population was addicted to drugs. And in 1970, the war on drugs was begun because at that time, it was estimated that 1.3% of the population was addicted. Well, 4 years ago, how many people do you think were estimated to be addicted after about 90 years of illegality, including over 40 years of a war against drugs? 1.3%. It is time for a new approach. Is legalizing drugs a good idea? I think so. I want to see drugs legalized, regulated, and taxed. By no means am I advocating a free-for-all, anything-goes, capitalism gone wild approach with drugs. I believe drug use is a personal matter, and drug addiction is a public health matter, not a matter for criminal justice. We've got to end this war on people who use drugs and try a better, smarter approach. legalize, regulate, and tax. So if you think you might be interested in the work we're doing at LEAP and would like to help us replace the war on drugs with some smart policies, regulation of drugs, not incarceration of drug users, I invite you to become members of LEAP. New members can join by visiting our website at leap.cc. I also have some information outside that you might find interesting. Thank you.